Chapter 8 of Sinister House by Leland Hall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Chapter 8. Change my opinions? As if I wouldn't have been glad enough to change them. Heaven knows I wasn't set up about having seen a ghost. Why, if only his telephoning to New York could have laid it and have averted the suffering and torment of the next 2 nights. I'd have recanted, I'd have denied myself, I'd have said my name is Jones while all the time it's Smith. But of course I did not know what was in store for all of us, and it wouldn't have done any good even if I'd said I was Jesse James. Believe me, I was miserable, that's all. Just plain miserable. And sort of loco with it. However, I won't hold up the rest of the story telling you what a rotten night I had. The next 2 were to make it look like, I was going to say 30 cents, but I guess I mean like a $10 gold piece. I do remember, though, that Annette was awfully anxious about me. And since the more I tried to explain, the more anxious she grew, I just subsided. But we kept the lights going until after 2. I liked the lights, because while they were going, I didn't have such terrible pictures of what Julia might be going through. It must have had its comical side, Annette stealing an anxious look at me every 2 or 3 minutes, I looking mournfully at her, and neither of us saying much. After we put out the lights, we both lay in our beds without moving, until about 4 I heard Annette get up and go to the window. "Haven't you been asleep, dear?" I whispered. "What's the matter?"
"I can't sleep for worrying. You have frightened the life out of me, Pierre. I don't know whether your mind's all right or not. You sound crazy. You looked wild tonight. You ought to see a doctor. And Julia, maybe she's crazy too. I don't think you ought to go there anymore."
"But she needs me. And you too. She and Eric are desperately afflicted. We mustn't go back on them. We mustn't withhold anything of comfort or strength to her. Don't be afraid." Let me remind you that it wasn't pleasant. I cannot remember much that happened the next day. I remember that it was fair, that the sun shone with a golden radiance in which no ghost could survive. Giles was at breakfast with us, though I found out later that he had not gone to bed at all. I tried to get him to come with my wife, the children, and me, but he would not be prevailed upon, and I dare say we had a jollier time without him. We had a picnic, somewhere in away from the river. We did not take the highway that ran past Eric's house. It was near a haymow, I think, against the side of which I slept in the warm sun for a couple of hours. If Annette read to Bobby at all, it was from Little Men, or it may have been Little Women. Though I passed a not-too-melancholy day, as we started home before sundown, I began to feel depressed. We picked up Dr. Gresham by the roadside on the way back. He was the only physician in Forsby, and his car had broken down out in the country. I remember we went a mile out of our way to take him to his house, and one or the other of us said half seriously that he hoped there'd be no sickness in the outlying parts of the community that night. Arrived home, Felicia told us that Mrs. Greer had telephoned in the afternoon to ask us over for dinner that evening. It was a trial. I did not want to go, and my wife was all for telephoning a flat refusal, but remembering the straits Julia was in, I felt it would be nothing short of treachery to go back on her. So Annette and I bathed, kissed the children good night, and ran over in the Ford. The night was unseasonably cold, and clear as crystal, but with no moon and only a few stars, a real darkness lay over the land. We had nothing to say to each other as we spun along the flat highway. Eric greeted us, and we found Giles seated before the grate in the living room, in which there was a bright yellow fire of cannel coal, the only light in the room. We asked him how he had spent the day, but he preferred not to tell us until later, and while we were waiting for Julia to come down, Eric led me out on the veranda over the cliff, just to see how black and mysterious the river looked down in its bed. There was no trace of twilight in the western sky, but there was a single bright star there, and looking far below I could see its reflection in the invisible water. My foot kicked against a stone on the veranda floor. Absent-mindedly I picked it up and leaned over the veranda rail, let it drop from loosened fingers. The ping of its hitting the boulders below and a faint splash were just audible in the otherwise wholly silent night. Why was it that, in the midst of such tranquillity, I had a sudden sense of evils being done? I straightened and turned round sharply, man's natural physical reaction to the spur of a sudden unpleasant thought. Eric was just on the point of speaking. He had actually said a word or two, which I missed. I think he meant to unburden himself of... Let it go. I have no proof. My sudden movement put an end to it anyhow. "What's the matter, Pierre?" he asked me quietly.
"Nothing," I responded. The side of the house was almost blotted out in the darkness, but looking restlessly toward the north, I saw a faint colorless glow. It seemed to come from a window in a bow that was built out from the side. The veranda did not run that far. Against the uncertain light I saw something moving, swinging slowly. It was a shutter, and as there was hardly a breath of air stirring, the movement struck me as queer and mysterious. I called Eric's attention to it. He started towards it, and I followed his vague form.
"I wonder," he said, "what has loosened that shutter? That is a window in the room to which Julia has taken her strange aversion."
We went to the end of the veranda, and he leaned out trying to touch the shutter, but could not reach it. "There's someone in the room," I suggested.
"That cannot be," he replied. "The door is always locked, you heard. No one is allowed to go into that room."
"But the light," I said.
"There's no light. Look for yourself."
True enough, there was no longer any light. Eric lit a match or two, which he held out as far towards the window as he could reach, and in the feeble glow of which he made out to his own satisfaction that the bolt on the shutter had not broken or rusted away.
"Julia must have sent someone in there today," he concluded.
At that moment someone stepped out on the veranda from the living room. It was Julia herself. Turning, we saw her, one side all white and bright, the other black and invisible. She hesitated a moment and then came quickly towards us.
"Eric," she cried, "what are you doing?"
She had a fit of coughing. Eric took her by the shoulders and marched her back whence she had come.
"I'm doing nothing," he replied, "to alarm you. You are not to come out of doors without a wrap, my dear. You will have pneumonia. Pierre discovered that the shutter to the forbidden room is open, and I was looking at it and wondering who could have opened it."
By that time we were going into the house again. Julia had lighted all the candles in the living room. It was warm and pleasant, and should have been cheerful, but turning round from latching the window through which we had come in, I caught a look of mingled incredulity and fear on Julia's face.
"No one has been in that room,"
she was whispering to her husband.
"The bolt must have rusted away."
"The bolt's all right," he said, "but you'll have to let me into the place, dear."
"Eric, I beg of you, not tonight. Not tonight. I don't feel well, you know. Humor me, dearest. Promise not tonight."
"Silly girl. Not tonight, then, or any night till you wish it."
He stooped as if to kiss her, but she turned abruptly from him and went to chat with my wife, and I saw his arms fall to his side in a gesture of hopelessness. Later, while we were at dinner, I could not keep my eyes from the blue velvet curtain on the wall opposite me. It hung motionless and obscure in the candlelight, apparently without significance to, at least apart from the consciousness of, the others in the room. Only when the old servant passed it on her rounds of service at the table did I see it stir, but I knew there was a doubly locked door behind it, and that in the room behind the door there was something Julia had cause to fear. I could not but ask myself again and again who or what had opened the shutter. I could not but wonder if the swaying of that thing I had so dimly perceived in the outdoor darkness were not an evil omen. In spite of my uneasiness, the dinner progressed smoothly. I dare say I ate my share of the good hot food, too, no matter what my apprehensions. Well, we left the dining room, 5 of us, and made our ceremonious way down the narrow, rose-colored hall corridor, and turned into the living room. Julia was keen on ventilation, and she had left one of the windows open during dinner, so that the room was fresh and cool. I can see her now as she went to close it, and as she came back to take her seat on a cricket by the fire of cannel coal. It was a pretty scene, what with the candlelight, the dancing yellow flames in the little grate, and the dancing sideshow in miniature shining from the polished rosewood of the piano across the room. The comfortable chairs and sofas with their bright cushions, the subdued colors of the hangings, through many of which there ran dull threads of gold that glimmered with reflected light. It was a long, narrow room of knickknacks and luxury, of beauty and shadow, of softness and glow, and above all, of comfort awaiting. I say we left the dining room, 5 of us, and came to this living room, Giles holding aside the portiere for us to pass in, but he had no sooner let it drop behind himself, the last to enter, than I knew there were 6 persons in that room. I felt it, as you count on your fingers 5, as you feel in every nerve in your body 6.
Perhaps I shouldn't imply 6 persons, 5 persons, and the specter, invisible until later in the evening, but present all the time. I did not need to look over my shoulder for it. I knew when it changed its place. I knew that for some time it paid no attention to us, but wandered aimlessly along the shadowy walls and across the space behind us. Then it began to disturb Julia and me, though still invisible. First I felt a fine but penetrating draught of cold air upon the back of my neck. Searching the inlet, I left my seat and went to the window that gave on the veranda over the river. It was tightly fastened, and the curtains before it did not sway a hair's breadth. No air blew in there from the outside. Besides, there was no wind anyhow. As I came back to my place on the sofa, Julia glanced up at me, and her look told me that it would be useless to try to shut off that discomforting draught. It came through no window. It had no direction. Yet when I settled down on the sofa, my neck below the back of it, from time to time the hair on my head was slightly moved, not by such a disturbance of air as would be created by the passage of a person behind me, but as if a mischievous sprite were blowing on it. Nothing could have been slighter or more swiftly passing, yet nothing, in that warm, firelit room and in the midst of a company apparently absorbed in intercourse, could have been more unnaturally and more insistently tormenting or more chilling. Over our coffee we talked of nothing at all. If I was ill at ease, then it was only from vague forebodings or troubled imaginings of what Julia might be dreading or even already suffering. I knew the spectre was in our midst. I had not begun to suffer from it. For a minute or two after the old servant had taken our cups away, too, the thing refrained from actual contact with me. Julia knocked the black lumps of coal into smaller pieces from which bright yellow flames burst out, illuminating our faces oddly. Annette took up her knitting. Giles lit a cigar. It was all peaceful enough. I remember that Eric sat behind us all, farthest from the fire, into which he gazed meditatively most of the evening, Annette tells me. Only she and Giles could watch his face. But Annette asked Giles quietly to tell us now how he had passed the day, and it was then I got up and went to the window to see if it was open. It was then I first felt that draught. I think it must have been the touch of icy, spectral fingers. I was able to listen to Giles's tale until this touch became something worse. I made the greatest effort of will I was capable of to follow him all along. I suspected that he was putting Eric through an inquisition, but later I both heard and did not hear. In response to Annette, Giles said he had a very interesting day, but before recounting it he began to praise Julia for the charm of her house, what she had been able to make out of such a freakish old summer cottage built by a man who, he had learned, had been noted for a cold sense of piety rather than a warm sense of beauty, and had certainly bequeathed her little to work on. I recall his accent on the word. It was a good thing for the commuters who lived in Forsby that Julia had come among them. Her influence would not be wholly lost. By the way, and he spoke to Eric, not Julia, how did you ever happen to come to this part of the world, Greer? You can imagine that Annette and I pricked up our ears at that. As for Eric, Annette told me afterwards that he never moved a muscle, except to raise his eyebrows, as if surprised that Giles should suddenly drag him thus into a conversation in which he had had but a drowsy interest. He answered lazily, clearing his throat a little. I don't remember, Pharaoh, just how it was, asked Julia. Do you, dear? Truly, I believe that the past was dead for him. By force of his will to live, he had made it as if it had never been. He denied it to himself, and if he denied it to himself, it was no lie for him to deny it to others. But Giles kept prodding and prodding into it, and was to do even more. I know that its sudden coming to life again drove Eric for the time being mad. Julia could have had no suspicion of what Giles was doing. She remembered how Eric and she had been led into this part of the world when, towards the end of their honeymoon, they were wondering where to settle down. Dear me, there was no talk this night as there used once to be, of building a nest and being so full of happy hopes that even the houses sang to them. The song in this house had been abominable. But someone had told them about Stanton, so...
We just came down to have a look around and stumbled on this house."
"Fancy that," said Giles, perhaps not heeding the weary tone of Julia's voice. "I never heard of Stanton until I came to Forsby, though I had seen the Forsby scheme more or less advertised. Someone in New York told you, I suppose. It is hard to think that it would occur to a New Yorker to recommend such a sleepy, out-of-the-way village."
"I don't remember who it was," Julia returned without much interest. "As a matter of fact, someone told Eric, and he told me."
She had a fit of painful coughing. Eric started from his chair and left the room to fetch her a warmer shawl. By the time he had come back, I had changed the conversation. He laid the shawl he brought with him tenderly about his wife's shoulders, and then took his seat again quietly. Giles began then to talk to us about religious mania. Judging by Eric's face, Annette told me, his thoughts might have been far away from the talk. He didn't move in his chair and continued to look meditatively into the fire. It seemed to me a silly thing for Giles to begin holding forth upon, but he was leading up to his interesting experience of the afternoon. I heard only a little of it. The intruder was beginning to bother me. In Stanton, that very afternoon, Giles had come across an extraordinary human creature, whom, for lack of any other word, he must call a girl. Though her face was not without a regularity of form and feature, she had appeared to him not more than half human. She was abnormally blonde. That struck one first. That and the peculiar, somewhat hypnotic stare of her eyes. He had heard and seen her speaking in the village store, and when she had opened her thin lips he saw that her teeth were white and small, but widely separated from each other. He got a most disagreeable impression of cruelty and wickedness under anemic but constant sanctimony. My recollections beyond this point are uncertain and intolerable to me. All the time I was listening to Giles, it seemed to me that the room grew darker and darker, and that the sixth presence materialized, yet took on no substance, became visible, remained transparent, and if I had any sensation but that of horror, it was a longing in some way to stand by Julia. Annette tells me that the room certainly was shadowy. Some of the candles had burned out, but it was very warm, not cold. Giles talked in his usual voice, and vividly, not as I thought in whispers and suggestively. She couldn't see his face very well in the firelight, but she remembers how the blue smoke from his cigar showed up, and she thinks maybe that was the ghost, in my mind. Julia turned round towards him once or twice. Yes, but she couldn't then see the expression of her face, for it was in shadow. She shouldn't have said it was horror-struck anyhow. It couldn't have been, for there was nothing horrible in what Giles said. No, Julia certainly did not fall in trying to get to Eric. Once she half lost her balance on the cricket. Maybe Annette thinks she was trying to change her position and her dress caught her, and then she put a hand down on the floor to keep from falling off. No, the room was certainly warm and very comfortable. What Giles said was very interesting, yes, but not very pleasant, not very nice. I looked half asleep in a position that you might think, Annette granted, a little stiff if your attention were called to it, but not enough to notice otherwise. I tell you, my recollections of the rest of that evening at Eric's are intolerable to me. I will not put myself, even in imagination, back in that room, warm and charming as it was. One night last winter, Annette and I went to visit some ancient relatives of mine who lived in an old house near Boston. It was a cold night, and we sat with the other guests before the grate, hung in under an old-fashioned white marble half-moon chimney-piece. The fire was of kennel coal, and there was no other light in the room. I stood it as long as I could, and then, knowing well I should be branded as a harsh and crude New Yorker by the sentimental, or was it thrifty, gathering, I demanded gaslight of my ancients. I would not sit, no matter what the cost to my reputation, in a circle of faces distorted and made luridly strange by the dancing light of cannel coal. Even in that room, where sanctimony masked nothing more hateful than complacency, I had already begun to feel that deadly, icy malice was taking the shape of a woman, loping from corner to corner and stealthily along the shadowy walls. 10 minutes more of that uncertain light, and I should have felt hands about my person, or should have seen them at the throat of my wife. No, not even in my imagination will I put myself back in the living room of Eric's sinister house for those few hours, warm and cozy as they say it was that night, when without the air was sharp and still and frosty. I drove Annette and Giles home in the Ford. They were tired. I was exhausted. None of us had slept the night before, yet Giles would have some beer and a cigarette. He struck me as boisterous and obtrusive.
"Well," he said to me, "what did you think of my story?"
"I didn't hear what you said," I replied, yawning.
"I know, nevertheless, I am on the track."
"Of what?"
"Of what is back of Eric Greer."
"Look here," I said, but without much fire. "If there's wrong about Eric, he's been the victim, and God knows still is the victim, not the wrongdoer. I don't want to hear any more about it. It's too horrible. What I know. I'm going to bed." To bed. I walked the floor for a couple of hours. Annette brought me some whiskey. Much whiskey. She was as calm and as patient as a woman well can be. She undressed and got into bed and went on with her knitting. Her eyes grew more and more anxious, till at last I caught a look in them which made me ashamed of my frenzy. Yet, all by my inner self, so to speak, I was shocked and desperate. I never have been able to see animals or persons suffer, and the thought of the hideous torture Julia might be undergoing, even as I paced up and down the room, all but unmanned me. I had seen them, yes, both, the woman and the little old man, trying to strangle her, and Annette thought she had tried merely to change her position on the cricket. You must imagine, the horrible picture came back before me again and again. I knew how those hands could clutch and pinch. They had been on me, but I give you my word I was nothing. Nothing. It was Julia, high-spirited, frail little thing, sick too, passionately in love with her husband, her heart crying out for him in her mortal need, yet wrenched, twisted, and beaten back by unutterably malevolent fiends that loped about him. She was so terribly alone. Eric, who would have given his lifeblood drop by drop for her, was sitting in the dark, wounded himself by her dumb actions, which he could only misunderstand, helpless to protect, even had he known, himself the instrument for her torture whenever he moved. But for my wife's look, I would have dashed my head against the wall. Instead, I threw myself on the floor beside her and hid my face on her bed. She kept on knitting. I heard the low sound of her needles, but I began after a few moments to feel the beneficence of her look. We waited a long time in silence. Then I said to her, "Are our children all right?"
"Yes, dear,"
she replied softly.
"They are sleeping peacefully, as you and I should be."
"We must never take them over there again."
"We shall not need to."
"What do you mean?"
"This cannot go on much longer, Pierre. Julia is going away. She told me in confidence tonight. They're going to give up the old house at once."
"And Eric?"
"He will go with her, I presume."
"No, no, no, that cannot be." Again there was a long silence between us. The clock downstairs struck 2. Very faint through walls and closed doors, I heard the regular, comical sound of Giles's snoring. An errant breeze came in through the window of our chamber. Even at this mysterious hour there was movement over the darkened face of the earth. "Annette," I asked, "what was Giles talking about?"
"About horrid, abnormal, and secret people. You know who. The father and the daughter. Insane, I guess, though very pious. The girl Giles saw in Stanton, you heard that, didn't you, is the cousin and spit image of the other girl."
"Morgan Snart and his daughter. They were there tonight."
"What do you mean?"
"Oh, Annette, you must believe what I say." When Giles began to speak, the woman stood behind Eric's chair. I didn't look, but I felt and I know she was there, and that she kept watching Julia and me. The little old man came in later and took his place behind Giles. He rubbed his hands all the time, and looked down at Julia often, ready to grab her if she tried to get to Eric. Think how terrible for a sensitive man like Eric if he ever had to be with things like them when they were alive. Annette said nothing. Indeed, what could she say? Except for the faint, regular sound of Giles's snoring, the house was silent as death. But after a while, Annette spoke again.
"Eric didn't seem very much interested," she said. "He was rather cynical. He was nervous about Julia. She had a bad cold, and Giles bored him, I guess. He got restless after a while and began to clasp and unclasp his hands. No wonder. Giles told some gruesome things, how they starved themselves and their animals, and how, though they were pillars of the church in that neighborhood, there was some horrid secret stories about the girls being cruel. Someone had seen her. "Annette," I whispered. That's when they moved, when Giles told about her beating the dog to death. That's when the old man made a sign to the woman, and they got ready to leap at Julia. "Did they?" asked Annette, as if sickened at all this. "Eric hated it. Did you see them attack Julia?" "Before heaven, I did, Annette. They sprang when Giles said their name was Snart." "No, dear," said my wife soothingly. "That's when Eric jumped up out of his chair to put an end to Giles's talk. Oh, my Peter, dear, let us not talk any more about it. Eric wouldn't like it. He hated it. Come, you will only make yourself sick. They are going away in a day or two. You've been thinking so much about that old house that you've got a kink in your brain. Julia's all right. She's got a heavy cold, that's all. And what could she expect from living in such a damp old place?"
"Annette," I said, looking up at her, "I have seen what I have seen."
"Do not talk about it. Do not mention any more horrors. I can't bear it."
"And I have heard what I have heard. Annette, Julia is in the most deadly and unnatural peril. She is sick and weak besides. There may be a fiendish death in that house."
"But they are going away, I tell you, day after tomorrow."
"If Eric goes too, with her."
"Good God, Pierre, you don't mean that he will murder her?"
She leaned forward over me, and I reached up for her hands. There was a moment's hush, and then, heaven save us, we heard the terrified screams of our son. Startled, Annette clutched me and almost stifled me. Then, as I broke away and got to my feet, her mother's instinct rose up within her, and she sprang out of bed and ran barefooted into the children's bedroom. I was hardly behind her. Bobby's screams had wakened the baby, and she too began to cry. All in the dark, my wife tore the little boy from his bed and hugged him to her breast. She could not wake him. He yelled the louder and beat at her with his fists. I switched on the lights. Annette was walking up and down like a wild, fierce woman, my buxom, merry wife, her hair flying about her, her bare feet falling soundless like the pads of a lioness's feet.
"Go away, bad dream! Boo, boo! Go away, bad, wicked dream! Boo! There, there, my darling boy, Mother's here. Mother will kill the bad dream, Mother will."
Something, as it were, flashed in my brain. I knew. Saying that the boy might be in pain, and that I would get hot water, I went out of the room. But I had no sooner closed the door behind me, as if to keep the sound of the screaming from Giles, that I darted into the northeast room, ripped off the shade from the window, and looked out. A waning moon shed light upon the highway, and on the highway I saw a man, hatless, running towards our house. He was almost here. If ever he got to my house, I knew my son might not survive the force of the evil that hounded him. I raced downstairs. The bolt on the front door stuck. My fingers were all thumbs. I thought I heard his steps on the granolithic walk, and I think I cried out in an anguish of fear, "Keep away! Keep away!" I swung the door open so that it crashed back against the wall. I rushed out and down the walk to the road. Eric ran into my arms. He struggled to get by me into the house, but I held him. "Be quiet," I whispered. "You can't go in there. For God's sake, what's the matter?" He was horribly out of breath. His face had the look of a man mortally stricken. In the wan moonlight, I saw the tears streaming down his cheeks. "It's Julia. She's sick. Our telephone. Out of order. Let me use yours." I was terribly alert. I pushed Eric away from our house and led him in a wide circle round to the garage and back, telling him the doctor's car was broken down, that he must go himself in my Ford. We pushed the Ford to the street along the smooth cement driveway. I didn't want Annette to know. The noise of the engine in the backyard. I cranked it. I shoved Eric into the front seat. I pushed the car off, and when I saw him well down the road, I went back into the house. Upstairs in the children's room, there was my son, laughing in his mother's arms. I had saved him. But it was almost the last straw for me that night. Annette said almost nothing to me until we were returned to our own room, and then, seeing that my face was terribly pale, she was frightened. At her words of solicitude, I sat down on my bed and broke down. Whereupon, treating me as if I, too, had had a bad dream, she patted my bent shoulders, caressed me, knelt down and took off my shoes and stockings, and I, a grown man, let her do it. She all but undressed me, and then she made me get into the bathtub, which she had filled with hot water. Just hot enough, because Annette always does things just right. When she tucked me into bed and gave me some hot whiskey and lemon, I didn't know whether I was laughing or crying. Nothing, up to that stage in the affair, had made me feel so bad as barring Eric from my house had made me feel. I would not have told my wife of it for anything. I did not wish her to turn against the unfortunate fellow. But she found out. She looked out the window and saw the garage door open. Then I had to tell her, for she would have gone down to close it, and would then have found the car gone. She hid her feelings. I did not know whether she associated Eric's comings with Bobby's bad dream. She would not let me talk at all, I remember, though the last thing I said to her before I went to sleep. I said to her, squeezing her hand, "Well, my dear, you don't see what Julia sees in that house after all." End of chapter 8.